Pitch black. You can't see your own hands. You can't feel your feet. Freezing water, just barely above 0 degrees Celsius, sloshes violently around your chest. The air is thick, poisoned by the stench of diesel fuel. Tony Bullimore is trapped in a tomb. He is 2,500 kilometers south of Australia, in the most remote, most violent stretch of water on the planet, the Southern Ocean. His 60-foot racing yacht, the Exide Challenger, is upside down. A catastrophic failure turned his high-speed vessel into a freezing coffin in seconds. The noise is deafening. It's like being inside a cement mixer filled with boulders, as 50-foot waves constantly smash against the hull. It's January 1997. For the outside world, Tony Bullimore has vanished. The newspapers are already preparing his obituary. The assumption is simple and brutal. He is dead. No one survives a capsize down here. The cold is far too intense. The forces are too extreme. But deep within the wrecked hull, in an air pocket the size of a phone booth, Tony is fighting. He is 57 years old, dehydrated, starving, and hypothermia is pulling him into darkness. He has 1 bar of chocolate, a damaged survival suit leaking freezing water, and a promise he made to his wife that he would come home. What you're about to witness is one of the greatest survival miracles in maritime history. This is the story of how Tommy Bullimore refused to die in the dark. The story starts with the race known as the Everest of the seas, the Vendée Globe. It is the ultimate test of human endurance. The rules are brutal. Sail around the world alone, without stopping, and without assistance. It is a grueling 27,000-mile ordeal that breaks younger, stronger sailors. More people have been in space than have completed this race. If your equipment breaks, you fix it. If you get sick, you treat yourself. If you fall overboard, you die. Tony Bullimore is not a novice. He was a former British Royal Marine, a man who understood discipline and hardship. He was tough, charismatic, and deeply ambitious. He ran a famous nightclub back in Bristol, England, and was known for his adventurous spirit. He lived on the edge. But more than the challenge, he loved his wife, Lilel. She was his anchor, the voice waiting for him back home. Before he left, he promised her he would return. He poured his money and his soul into the Exide Challenger. It was a state-of-the-art racing machine, worth over $1 million. It was built purely for speed. But speed comes at a cost. In the 1990s, yacht design was pushing boundaries. To be fast, the boat was light, and its stability relied entirely on a massive, heavy keel, a huge fin extending deep below the hull filled with lead ballast. This keel is what keeps a sailboat upright against the force of the wind. As 1996 turned to 1997, the race entered its most terrifying phase, the Southern Ocean. This isn't the Atlantic or the Pacific. This is a different beast. There are no land masses here to slow down the wind. Storm systems circulate Antarctica unimpeded, generating waves the size of apartment buildings. I should know. I've been there. It's an area where you're closer to the astronauts in space than anyone on land. The water is lethally cold. Tony knew the risks. He had been battling severe weather for weeks. He was exhausted, sleep-deprived, and constantly drenched. But he was holding his position and performing well, sitting in the top tier of the race. Then, on January 5th, the ocean decided to show its full power. A massive low-pressure system descended with terrifying speed. The wind escalated to 70 knots, hurricane force. The waves grew monstrous. The noise was a constant roar. The Exide Challenger was being hammered. Tony was inside the cabin, smartly wearing his full survival suit, trying to manage the storm, when he felt a sudden, violent lurch. A sickening crack echoed through the hull, and it wasn't the sound of a wave breaking, it was the sound of a catastrophic failure. The keel, the 4.5-ton weight that kept him stable, had just snapped clean off. In a fraction of a second, the Exide Challenger flipped. The world just turned upside down. The violence of the capsize threw Tony across the cabin. Water rushed in instantly, and everything was chaos. Furniture, supplies, equipment, all crashing around him in the dark. The freezing water hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath. He was disorientated, submerged, and he knew he was drowning. His Royal Marine training kicked in. Panic kills. He didn't try to escape the boat. Outside meant certain death in the freezing storm. He had to find air inside. He clawed his way through the debris, pulling himself against the rush of incoming water. And then, his head broke the surface. He gasped, pulling in air mixed with the toxic smells of diesel fumes. He had found an air pocket in what used to be the galley area. But his relief was instantly crushed by the horror of his situation. He was alive, yes, but he was entombed. The boat was completely inverted. The cabin roof was now the floor. The escape hatches were meters below him, submerged in the freezing ocean. The hull was thick, designed to withstand the sea, but now it was his prison wall. It was pitch black, absolute terrifying darkness. He couldn't see his hand in front of his face. The sensory deprivation was intense, but the noise was overwhelming. The sound of the waves crashing against the hull was amplified inside, like being inside a drum. It was a constant, violent shaking. He never knew when the next massive wave would hit, threatening to break the boat apart. He was wearing a specialized neoprene survival suit, which was the only reason he wasn't already dead. But the suit was damaged. One of the watertight seals around his wrist had torn during the capsize. Freezing water was seeping in, slowly filling the suit. The cold was the immediate killer. In water this cold, survival time is measured in minutes. His first priority was to get out of the water. He explored his tiny prison. Most of the interior was submerged. He managed to find some cargo netting and ropes floating in the debris. Using incredible ingenuity in the pitch dark, Tony managed to string up a makeshift hammock in the air pocket, just above the waterline, sloshing inside the cabin. He hauled himself out of the water. This hammock saved his life. It kept him dry enough to slow the onset of severe hypothermia. He assessed his resources. They were almost non-existent. His emergency garb bag containing flares and food was lost. He searched desperately. Everything was scattered, spoiled by the seawater and diesel. But then, a small miracle. Floating past him in the darkness, he bumped into something solid. He grabbed it, a small amount of fresh water, and then, incredibly, a single bar of plain chocolate. This was it. This was all he had to survive. He knew he had one chance. When the boat capsized, his EPIRBs, emergency position indicating radio beacons, should have activated. These devices send a distress signal to satellites, but activating it didn't guarantee rescue. It only meant someone somewhere might know he was in trouble. They wouldn't know if he was alive, and they were thousands of miles away. Tony was alone in the dark. The first 24 hours was a battle against panic. The darkness played tricks on his mind. The constant, violent motion of the boat made him sick. He focused on his wife, Lilel. He pictured her face. He talked to her in the darkness. "Don't worry, love. I'll be home soon," he said. He couldn't let her receive the news that he was gone. This singular focus became his anchor. He started rationing his supplies immediately. A tiny nibble of chocolate, a little sip of water. He knew this ordeal could last days, if he survived that long. The cold was a constant, agonizing pain. The damaged wrist seal was a critical problem. He tried to tie it closed with a small piece of string, but his fingers were already numb and clumsy. He was losing feeling in his hands, and he knew that frostbite was setting in. One finger, which had been severely injured during the capsize, was already turning black. Day 2. The storm continued to rage. He had to maintain the air pocket. He He worried that the air might run out, or that the water level inside the hull might rise. The air pocket was unstable. When a large wave hit the hull, the pressure inside would increase and the water level inside would rise, sometimes covering his face. He had to constantly adjust his position, clinging to the netting. Time lost all meaning. There was no day or night, just the endless dark and the roar of the ocean. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Canberra, Australia, the distress signal had been received. The location was daunting, deep in the Southern Ocean, far beyond the range of normal rescue operations. A massive search and rescue mission was immediately launched by the Australian Maritime Safety Authority. The Royal Australian Air Force dispatched P-3 Orion aircraft to the area. These long-range patrol planes began the painstaking process of searching the vast, storm-tossed ocean. But the situation grew more complicated. Another distress beacon activated. Thierry Dubois, another Vendée Globe competitor, had also capsized, not far from Tony's location. The Southern Ocean had claimed another victim, Jerry Roof, just days earlier. He was never found. Now the Australians had multiple disasters on their hands. The Orion aircraft found Thierry Dubois relatively quickly. He had managed to get into his life raft. He was alive. But the Exide Challenger was a different story. When the aircraft finally located Tony's yacht, the sight was grim. The boat was completely upside down, only the bottom of the hull visible, constantly washed over by massive waves. There was no life raft, no sign of Tony. The assumption was that Tony had gone down with the ship. After several flyovers with no sign of life, the official assessment leaned toward the tragic. Tony Bullimore was likely dead. Back in the UK, the news was devastating, but Lillel refused to accept it. She told the media, "He is alive. I know he is. He is a fighter." The Australian Navy dispatched the guided missile frigate HMAS Adelaide. It took days for the warship to reach their location. Their primary mission was to rescue Thierry Dubois. Their secondary mission, grimly, was to inspect the hull of the Exide Challenger, perhaps to recover Tony's body for his family. Back inside the hull, Tony was deteriorating. It had been 4 days. The cold had taken a severe toll. He was shivering uncontrollably. This was a dangerous sign. It means the body is losing the fight to maintain its core temperature. Soon, the shivering would stop, and then he would simply fade away. He had finished the chocolate. The fresh water was gone. Dehydration was now the biggest threat. It was a desperate attempt to stay hydrated. He used a small tube he found to try and collect condensation dripping from the inside of the hull. It was barely enough to wet his lips, and it tasted foul, contaminated by the diesel fumes and the boat's materials. The psychological pressure was immense. He started hallucinating. He saw lights in the darkness. He heard voices calling his name. He fought against the overwhelming urge to give up, to slip into the cold water and let the darkness take him. Lillel. He just kept repeating her name. By the 5th day, Tony was weak. He knew he couldn't last much longer. He was accepting his fate. He closed his eyes. On the morning of January 9th, HMAS Adelaide arrived on the scene. The conditions were still rough. The warship first moved to rescue Thierry Dubois. They successfully pulled him from his life raft. He was exhausted, but alive. Then the Adelaide turned its attention to the Exide Challenger. The plan was to launch a RIB, a rigid-hulled inflatable boat, to get close to the capsized yacht. A team of Navy divers would inspect the wreck. They were considering scuttling the boat, sinking it so it wouldn't be a hazard to navigation. They weren't expecting to find survivors. As the RIB approached the massive, scarred hull, the tension was high. The yacht was unstable, rolling heavily in the waves. One of the standard procedures when approaching a capsized vessel is to bang on the hull. It's a way to check the structural integrity and, in the rarest of cases, to signal any potential survivors. A Navy sailor, able seaman Alan Bloxham, leaned over and hammered on the hull. Boom, boom, boom. Inside the hull, Tony heard the banging. It wasn't the random noise of the ocean, it was deliberate. It was human. A surge of adrenaline flooded his system, cutting through the exhaustion and the pain. Hope, which had almost died, reignited fiercely. He started screaming and shouting at the top of his lungs, "I'm here, I'm coming." He hammered back with all his strength he could muster. The rescue team froze. They looked at each other in disbelief. They heard his muffled shouts. Someone was alive inside the wreck. The mission parameters changed instantly. This was no longer a recovery, it was a race against time. The rescue team knew they couldn't cut the hull. It was too thick, and they risked sinking the boat entirely, destroying the air pocket that was keeping Tony alive. The only way out was underwater. The divers entered the water. They shouted instructions, telling him to swim down and out. Tony heard the voices. He knew this was it. He had to make a terrifying decision. To escape, he had to leave the safety of his air pocket and dive down into the freezing, pitch-black water. He had to swim through the wrecked cabin, find the exit, and get out before he ran out of breath or succumbed to the cold shock. If he got disorientated, if he got trapped in the debris, he would drown just meters from safety. He took a deep breath, filling his lungs with the foul-smelling air from his prison, and he plunged into the darkness. The shock of the cold water was agonizing. He fought against the instinct to gasp. He navigated by touch, feeling his way through the familiar layout of his boat, now inverted and alien. He felt his way along the interior, his numb hands searching for the companionway hatch. He found the opening. He pulled himself through, out into the open ocean. Outside, the rescue team waited anxiously. Seconds stretched into an eternity. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the water. He burst to the surface, gasping for air. The sudden light was blinding after 5 days of total darkness. His face was pale, covered in grime and diesel, and he was shaking uncontrollably. The Australian soldiers stared in disbelief. They had expected to find a body. Instead, they saw a man, alive, grinning despite the pain. One of the rescuers reached out and grabbed him. His first words were simple, but they carried the weight of his ordeal. "Thank God, it's a miracle." Then, in true British fashion, he added, "Do you have a cup of tea?" He was rushed back to the HMAS Adelaide. The medical team immediately began treating him for severe hypothermia, dehydration, and frostbite. The damaged seal on his suit and the injury during the capsize had cost him. He would lose the tip of one finger, and the others were severely damaged. But he was alive. When asked how he survived, he credited the chocolate. "If it hadn't been for this, I wouldn't be here." The news flashed around the world. The miracle of the Southern Ocean. Tony Bullimore, the man everyone thought was dead, was alive. Aboard the Adelaide, Tony was reunited with Thierry Dubois, the other sailor who had been rescued. They shared a bond forged in the extreme danger of the Great South. Tony was finally able to call his wife, Lilel, back in Bristol. Lilel had refused to give up hope. When the call came, the emotional release was overwhelming. He had kept his promise. He was coming home. When the HMAS Adelaide docked in Perth, Western Australia, Tony Bullimore walked off the ship to a hero's welcome. He was greeted by crowds and the media, and later even received by the Queen. Tony's survival forced the Vendée Globe to implement stricter safety rules regarding boat design, as the 1996-97 race was brutal. Of the 16 starters, only 6 finished. The failure of the Exide Challenger's keel led to significant changes in how keels were tested and inspected. Despite the trauma and the physical injuries, Tony Bullimore didn't abandon the sea. The ocean had nearly killed him, but it was still his passion. Just a year later, he was racing again. In 2005, at the age of 66, he led a team in a major ocean race. He remained a symbol of resilience, a testament to the extraordinary strength of the human spirit when trapped between the darkness of the abyss and the faintest glimmer of hope. You won't believe what the people in these next two stories did to survive. Click now to see what they did to stay alive, and ask yourself, could you do the same? Subscribe for more, and I'll see you soon.